In today's podcast, I will be talking with William Allen. He has studied psychology. He is a certified hypnotist and author to Confessions of a Sensitive Man, as well as On Being a Sensitive Man. William works to spread awareness on hypersensitive people, specifically males. Keep listening as I talk to him about hypersensitive people, masculinity, and our insensitivity to sensitivity. So tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you're about, and what you're doing at the moment.
Okay. I my primary focus during my career, so I'm sort of semi-retired now, but I worked in information technology as a manager for a large bank in the U.S. About 10 years ago, I retired. I got an early retirement and decided that I wanted to do something completely different. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I wanted to use that area more than I did the technology side of it. So I kind of pivoted away from that and opened a small business in a small town in Oregon, which is where I was from before I lived here in Florida. And it was called Brain Pilots. And what I did was I had taken some training in hypnosis and also some training in neurofeedback brain training. So I did that for a couple of years, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with people. I was really happy working one-on-one with people, helping them just kind of deal with some everyday type of issues and problems. It was not supposed to be therapeutic, and it wasn't. So I wasn't trained as a therapist. But anyway, it was a nice sort of second career for me. A couple of years ago, my stepdad passed away, and my mom was in Texas, and I moved to Texas to help her out, help her get things together so she could move to Florida, which is where she is here today in Florida, and so am I. During that time, I started writing a blog. Now, I have a personality trait, which about 20% of the human population has, which is called sensory processing sensitivity, or probably more commonly called high sensitivity. And I started writing a blog about men who had high sensitivity, because there wasn't a whole lot of people that were writing about it at the time. And so I started writing this blog, and I did it for a couple of years. And at the end of that time frame, probably about 2 years into it, I figured I had enough material that I could write a book. And I started to write the book, Confessions of a Sensitive Man, which is the first book I had out. And it was about my life journey as a highly sensitive man, how I dealt with it, and the things that I had learned and observed over the course of my life. Taught me a lot about masculinity too, and some thoughts that I had about that. On the heels of that book, I also wrote the second book, almost at the same time, called On Being a Sensitive Man, which is kind of like what I call a trail guide for highly sensitive men. It's not a end-all, be-all book for being a highly sensitive man, but it certainly has some of the observations that I've had, some of the things that I've learned over the years that have helped me. And now because of COVID and so forth, I don't get really much of an opportunity to do speaking engagements. I'd love to do it, but I do a lot of podcasts now, and I try to get the word out about the books and about the trait, particularly about the trait, because I feel like a lot of men have the trait, don't really truly understand it, and are a little bit shy about admitting that they're sensitive. It's tough for guys because, most men don't want to be measured up as being sensitive. I mean, that's just the way we're all raised. But what they need to do is learn more about the trait. And that's what the books do, and that's what I try to do in these podcasts.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic. What exactly is a highly sensitive person, though? What does it mean to be a highly sensitive person for someone that's not familiar with it?
Okay. There's a simple definition that Dr. Elaine Aron, who is the person who kind of put high sensitivity on the map. She wrote the book Highly Sensitive Person back in the mid-90s. She's written several books since then, but she is really the kind of the spearhead on research and on helping define what this is. So she uses this acronym called DOES, D-O-E-S. And that really is the four main attributes of high sensitivity. Um, the letters stand for, and I'll go down the list of the letters
Mhm.
here. D stands for depth of processing. Highly sensitive people are very deep thinkers, and they process information very deeply. It's not just a shallow kind of thing. It's a real churning of information over and over again. Sometimes it leads to things like overthinking and rumination, but for the most part, it has a purpose, and that purpose is to take the sensory information that we pick up, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and to be able to make sense of it, to be able to connect dots. And I think what you see is, because so many highly sensitive people are creative types, that this deep processing helps them. So people who think on a very deep level, almost kind of philosophical level, whether it's emotional content or environmental content that's coming in, we tend to be those people that do a lot of that deep thinking. The O stands for overstimulation and overwhelm. Because highly sensitive people take in a lot of information, sensory information, environmental information, it gets to be overwhelming. We take in more probably than the other 80% of the population does. And just wanted to mention that sensitivity is a spectrum. It isn't just highly sensitive people and everybody else. Everybody has a degree of sensitivity. Those people who are on the lower end of the, say, the bell-shaped curve, have a lower, they have lower sensitivity in terms of how they're impacted by the environment, but they're more resilient, and they're usually more likely to take risk and do risky behaviors. There's a benefit in doing that for the species, but there's also this other side, the highly sensitive people who are more cautious, and are people that are, good at giving advice and counsel, and trying to keep the rest of the population from jumping over the cliff, so to speak. So you need the two to balance. I mean, it's one thing about nature that I know for a fact, that there has to be this balance in order for it to work optimally. But anyway, the overwhelm and the overstimulation part of it is just something that we deal with. A lot of highly sensitive people, when they get overwhelmed, they kind of shut down. And they want to go by themselves. They want to regroup and re-energize and so forth. They like to get away from crowds. One of the things highly sensitive people like to do a lot of is be out in nature. Go out by themselves, walk, take a walk or a hike or something like that. And that's one of the things that we do is pretty universal with highly sensitive people, is this idea of being overwhelmed by the amount of information we're getting.
Mm-hmm.
Third letter is the E, and that stands for two things. One, it stands for emotional reactivity. Okay? Highly sensitive people, not only do they think deeply, they feel deeply. They have very deep sense, sort of deep-rooted emotional responses. And, that means that we're likely to cry at a beautiful sunset or a very moving piece of art, whether it's a film or a picture or a painting or something. We're like that. We absorb that emotion, and it really gets expressed at a very deep level. So we feel our emotions very deeply. The other half of that is empathy. Highly sensitive people are very empathetic, and they tend to be in helping professions, whether they're counselors or teachers or doctors or nurses or whatever. That's really where highly sensitive people are sort of their best element, when they're helping. And so that empathy creates that kind of desire to help. And we do tend to be more empathic too. I mean, we can walk into a room, we can sense the vibe, we can sense things that are going on. And there's nothing really necessarily psychic about that. It's just that we're more in tune with the subtleties out there, which leads to the last letter, which is the S. And this is what Dr. Ehring describes as the sort of being able to sense the subtleties in the environment. This is just picking up little minute cues in the environment. So I always like to use the metaphor, like if a highly sensitive person walks into a party, well, they're going to be the ones that notice that somebody's wearing very strong perfume on the other side of the room, or that the hors d'oeuvres are too salty, or the music's too loud, or the vibe of the room is that everybody's in a certain mood or whatever. They're the ones that will pick up that kind of information. And so that's another way that we feed into this overwhelm sometimes is we're picking up very subtle pieces of information, and it can be overwhelming at times. So all those things together are the four main building blocks, if you will, of what a highly sensitive person is. You know, as the research grows, it gets more and more defined. I'm sure there'll be added things that go along with it, but right now I'm trying to stick with what we know from a scientific point of view.
Mm-hmm. So is this more of a hereditary type of thing, or is it kind of picks up maybe through your environment as you grow up?
Both. The you know the numbers are that it's supposed to be somewhere between 50 and 60% hereditary. The environment plays an enormous impact on highly sensitive people. So, for example, if a highly sensitive person is raised in a very supportive, nurturing environment where they're given a lot of freedom to be who they are and supported that way emotionally, they tend to excel. I mean, it more so than anybody else in the population. They excel in a positive environment. So that's called vantage sensitivity. If they're in a negative environment, it impacts them more than it does anybody else. So they may move towards depression, and they may move more towards anxiety and neuroticism. So it has an enormous impact. But I think the basic bones of this trait are genetic. And the rest of it is depending on what kind of environment they grow in, is determines what kind of impact it has on the sensitivity level that they have. But to answer your question, it's a little bit of both.
Mm. Okay. So how did you find out that you were highly sensitive? What kind of led you to figuring it out?
Well, you know, Lisa, I probably known my whole life that I was different. I mean, one of the things I think most sensitive people have heard is that they're too sensitive, they're too emotional, they're too overreactive, you know, and that's a negative way of acknowledging somebody's sensitivity. But that's for the most part before Dr. Ahrens had written her book, and it became a sort of a known quantity or entity. Most of us who grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like I did, we had no reference point. So we just kind of felt like we were odd and out, kind of outcasts and so forth, and just sort of lived with the trait. I know as a man, I tried very hard to kind of push it down and try to live in a more masculine framework, or what we call masculinity. But probably in the early 2000s is when I actually picked up Dr. Ahrens' book and I read it. And you know, as I read it, like so many people I talk to are sensitive, they say, everything in the book was me. It was like, yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. But as a man, I was having a hard time with that. I didn't want to be labeled sensitive. I still was struggling with that whole idea. It took me about 10 years of mulling it through and acknowledging it, but not really embracing it. And then when I started writing the blog in 2016, that's when I really started saying, you know what, this is who I am, and there's got to be some positives in that. And the research I was doing at the time that got fed into the books supported that idea, as has always been the case with Dr. Ahrens. She's always painted this in a positive light. So that's about the time that, like I said, it was a kind of an art when I first found out about the trait, and then when I actually started embracing it, which is what I think we need more people to do, especially men.
Yeah, we often seem to label being sensitive as a negative thing when really it's not. Really, it's quite useful. How would someone figure out if they are a highly sensitive person? Is there like a test or something they can take?
Yeah, there is. Right now, the only valid, reliable test we have is Dr. Ahrens' questionnaire, which she has on her website, hsperson.com. There's a tab you can go to, and it'll take you to the test. It probably has about 26, 27 questions on it. Really simple to get through. It'll probably take you no more than 10, 15 minutes to do.
Okay.
And it's a self-grading test, so you'll know right away. And one thing I would say to people is this, is if you take the test and let's say a minimum number is 14 out of 26 or whatever it is, if you score 13 or 12, you're still pretty high, but just below the threshold, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that some of these things don't apply to you as well.
Okay.
But for most people who score over, it's usually pretty obvious to them, I think. And I think many people, once you start talking about the trait, they know that applies to me, So, but go take that test. That'll be your benchmark. It'll tell you whether or not you are.
Yeah, it's something I'll do after this. Is there like quite an even split between men and women who have this trait then, or?
It's almost exactly down the middle.
Okay.
You would think, and I think society thinks that sensitivity, especially emotionality, is a female thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that for highly sensitive people, it breaks down about 50-50. And this is one of the things I think highly sensitive men can really help other men with embracing the fact that having emotion is a human characteristic. It's not a female or a male thing. I realize that there are some biological differences, obviously, between men and women, hormonal
Mm-hmm.
differences between them. But in a lot of cases, we're very much alike. And I think the emotional part of it is something that we both share. Emotions serve a very important purpose for human behavior. And so one of the things we're seeing, and what's been showing up quite a bit in studies lately, is the health of men is starting to deteriorate. It has probably been like that for years, but it's really starting to document it now. One of the reasons why men have such difficulty with their health and health issues, and mental health issues particularly, is because they don't want to show vulnerability. They don't want to ask for help. And they don't want to show the emotions that they think make them look weak.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something where I think highly sensitive men, since it's so much more natural for us to be emotional, should be out there modeling what that can be like. Now, I'm not talking about becoming emotional wrecks, right? But I'm saying that people should be able to express their feelings. If you're hurting, you're hurting. You should let that out. There's a reason why you have that emotion. Or if you're fearful or whatever, you should be able to share that with people and try to get help if you need it.
Mm. Where do you think that comes from, the idea that men should be not sensitive?
Well, I think it's really been ingrained in us for centuries, probably
Mm-hmm.
millennium. It could be some religious context that says basically men are supposed to be dominant, and they're supposed to be stoic and warrior-like and so forth. But it's really been ingrained in us for a long time. And I think one of the things that a lot of the highly sensitive men that I've talked to, some of the thought leaders in the highly sensitive group community, are starting to talk about, we ought to really be looking at redefining what masculinity means.
Mm-hmm.
And by that I mean not necessarily throwing everything out and starting over, but looking at some of these things that really are not working. And what I'm very encouraged by is the fact that the younger men that I talk to are all open to this idea. They seem to be much more receptive to the idea. The world has changed. I mean, it really has changed. Men's roles, women's roles have changed in the last 40, 50 years like they've never changed before. And so we need to look at the way we define gender in terms of what roles are, what we do, and that kind of thing. And I really would like to see us expressing some of this stuff in more human qualities. This is stuff that we both share, both men and women. And being human first, and then if we have to bucket ourselves into male, female, or other, or whatever gender preference a person has or feels that they are, should be something that we include, right? And we can't do that. We've got a sort of a binary choice. You've got to be this way or you've got to be that way.
Yeah, because that doesn't really work for anyone, because everyone's just on such a spectrum of differences. You can't just pigeonhole people into being one specific way or another. Since discovering you were a highly sensitive person, and venturing on a journey to better understand it. What have you learnt from your experiences of being highly sensitive and from meeting other people with similar traits along the way?
One of the things, and I was just talking to a group of highly sensitive people yesterday, that I've learned is that one of the things that highly sensitive people do is they almost build an immediate rapport when they see each other. It's almost like an old, long-lost member of a family or something. It's very easy for highly sensitive people to talk to each other. Now, highly sensitive people sometimes struggle talking, right, in front of people or with other people, because about 70% of highly sensitive people are introverted. Now, there are 30% that are extroverted, but the fact is, it's difficult for us sometimes to talk, especially in large groups of people with it's sort of a mixed crowd. One of the things that, like I said, I've learned about highly sensitive people is that given an opportunity to be around people like sort of in the tribe, is this immediate rapport that we have with each other. The ability to talk and be honest and open and authentic and be who you are and not worry about having to pretend to be something else. And that's something that as I talk more and more and more to highly sensitive people, and particularly to highly sensitive men, it's a wonderful feeling to know finally you found people who understand you. And that's a great thing. So the things I've really learned more than anything else, I think, Lisa, over the course of my life, is that I feel like I'm in a place now where I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not. Now, being highly sensitive has been around since humans have walked the earth, right? It's been, nature kind of bakes us in. One of the reasons why high sensitivity is a valuable trait is because nature has to have sort of that balancing features we talked about earlier in the show. You've got the risk takers on the one side, and you need some sort of cautious, thoughtful, conscientious people on the other side to balance. And I think that's one of the purposes that we served. And I feel like right now, in the history of the history of the world, we need highly sensitive people more than ever, and we need highly sensitive people to step up, and we need them to acknowledge the trait, embrace the trait, model some of these kindness, compassionate, empathetic, nourishing characteristics that are innate for a lot of highly sensitive people. Now, I don't want to paint highly sensitive people as being angels that don't have any faults, right? Because we do. I've met some people who are highly sensitive that sort of go against type here, what you would think. But the reality is that a lot of these things that I was just talking about are things that come easy to us. And these are things that may be harder for other people to embrace. And we need good thought leaders across the board, but I think highly sensitive people can do that.
Yeah. So there can be a lot of stigma around being overly sensitive, especially if you were a man. How do you think cultural stigma kind of affects highly sensitive people?
Oh, it affects it tremendously. And men, and I can't speak for women, obviously, because I grew up, in a culture, especially in the southern United States, which are very traditional. Male-female kind of cultural traits that they impart into us. We're socialized from the very time we're little kids. Little boys are told, you can't cry. You're going to be like a girl. Like being a girl is a bad thing to be, but nevertheless, the point is we get socialized very early. And then there's boy codes that are enforced by boy groups, right, where they're trying to force into that masculine model. Eventually, it grows up into a man code, which boys are, fathers and other adult males do this with boys as well. So the cultural stigma of going against that type that we're trying to, that masculine type that we project, which is, again, the stoic, unemotional, totally logical, never needs help, always can fend for themselves kind of male, it's an impossible ideal. There's no man out there, I don't care how strong they may appear to be, that can do that effectively. And it's something that we try to lock our males into. They have to be this way. They have to, and men, once you've got to, say, like my age, you've been hearing that all your life, you really start policing yourself about, oh, I can't do that. I can't show emotion. I can't appear to be looking for help or anything like that. So that's one of the things that you're right. There is a strong cultural stigma that's attached to sensitivity, but that's where educating people, and especially highly sensitive people, about what the trait is, I think has helped me more than anything else. I mean, it made me realize there's a reason why I get overwhelmed. There's a reason why I get more emotional. There's a reason why, I stop and think deeply about things and take things into consideration the way I do. That's the way I'm wired. And so once you learn that, you start to say, okay, that's not so bad, because those same characteristics produce great poetry. They produce people who are helpful and kind, and people who can be able to connect dots that other people don't see, and they're able to pick up things in the environment that nobody else is seeing. That's a gift to be able to do that. But it's learning to deal with those other parts, because there is challenges to this trait. I'm not going to kid anybody here. The overwhelm is real, right? And sometimes the emotion needs to be regulated some too. And this is where highly sensitive people need to learn some of these coping skills as well.
Are there any particular cultures, do you know, that kind of would accept sensitive people more?
That's a good question. As I'm learning more, I mean, I'm very familiar with the West, of course. You and I are sort of subject to the Western cultural norms. What I'm finding, though, is that even in Eastern cultures, and even Middle Eastern cultures, these same norms that we have in the West about male-female role and sensitivity in general are about the same. It's funny because I read an article in the New York Times somewhere. Somebody had written about the Chinese government was cracking down on what they termed as sissy boys or sissy men, because some of the entertainers in communist China, I suppose, and now there's a little bit more freedom to do things expressive wise, are showing some of these things that are more androgynous, and that is bothering the government, because they don't want to project that image of being that way, because that means they're weak. They don't want their males to project an image of weakness. So it seems to be pervasive, but yeah, there probably is some cultures that are more conducive to it. I think would be more receptive to high sensitivity. I just think we need to start educating people across the board, all over the world, about this.
Yeah, for sure, because it's not something you're really ever taught about necessarily either. Like, you wouldn't really come across it. Like, I haven't really come across it until, like, I heard about you recently. So, yeah, it's definitely something we need to start teaching people more in schools, especially, I think, would be good.
Well, that would be really helpful if teachers, doctors, especially pediatricians, uh, more psychologists, more therapists, more coaches, coaches for sporting activities, uh, would at least be enough educated about it so they can understand how to work with highly sensitive kids, right? I know I playing sports when I was a kid. The coaches would be very like drill sergeants. They were like Marines. They were yelling and screaming at you if you did the slightest thing wrong. For a highly sensitive person, that's not going to work. It just isn't going to work. That doesn't mean babying anybody, but what it does mean is you need to alter your communication style, I think, to be effective with different types of people. And the more people understand about this trait, I think the better they'll be able to help highly sensitive people through difficult times, especially children, because they really don't know any better.
Yeah. Yeah, because especially, like, people have different learning styles as well. So you have, like, kinesthetic, things by sight,
Absolutely.
all that kind of category of things.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. I'm sure, like any personality trait, that being a highly sensitive person can have an impact on your relationships and friendships. What does this impact tend to be? So, do people who are highly sensitive often struggle to be open about it? Do they often hide it? And do they maintain their relationships better, maybe, because they're more sensitive?
Yeah, well, when I wrote in the book, and I was really specifically targeting men, but it's probably true for all highly sensitive people, that we, as highly sensitive people, probably should be very careful about who we connect with socially and also who we become involved with. It's very misunderstood by a lot of people, and so you've got highly sensitive people, a lot of who don't even know they're highly sensitive, that are trying to get into relationships with other people who are not so highly sensitive. And their tolerance level for each other may not be conducive for a good relationship. Dr. Aaron has written absolutely the book, because she's one of the leading authorities on love, her and her husband, Arthur Aaron, on highly sensitive people in love. It's probably the best book to read about those kind of things, because she does hypotheticals, pairing up two highly sensitive people to a highly sensitive person with a non-highly sensitive, the kind of things you need to look for, the kind of things you need to be able to be honest about. And I think the thing for highly sensitive people that's really important here is that they are honest with the trait up front with people. I think it's only fair to your potential partner that they understand that you're affected by things in a different way than perhaps they are. And if it doesn't work out, I think highly sensitive people particularly need to realize it's not a failure on your part necessarily. It just is not going to work for somebody else who may not be as empathetic or sympathetic to the fact that they're dealing with somebody. This is tough for men, because men go into relationships and they're having to project this sort of strong, quiet, strong, kind of emotionally, reserved individual. And for highly sensitive men, that's tough to do. And some women, they don't care for that. They don't want to see a highly sensitive or emotional man. So that's why I say you have to choose your partners carefully. But I think more than anything else, the honesty part is the thing. You just need to come out right away. Somehow work it into conversations about this trait. Maybe talk to them sort of almost as an educational thing. If you've educated yourself enough about it, that way that at least they know going into it that when they yell at you for something or they criticize you for something, that you might take it a little tougher than somebody else who's less sensitive.
And I guess it goes back to balance. So like if you're with someone that's not necessarily highly sensitive, they can learn from you, but you can like maybe pick up things from them as well. So
absolutely,
things work out better.
That's really all relationships. Is about compromise and balance. But you have to have a partner that's willing to work with you.
Yeah, for sure.
And you need to work with them. That's absolutely true. It is not a one-way street.
So we live in a world that can be quite insensitive. So typically, as we've kind of covered, like a more traditional view of what masculinity is idealized for men. How can men feel comfortable expressing this side of them when often it may be seen as weakness, and in fact a character trait that often other men who may be sensitive themselves reject other men for, because they're not comfortable with it?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because a lot of sensitive men reject it too. And they reject the thing within themselves that it is. This is why I say if you understand the trait well enough, when you present the trait. Now, here's one thing that is really getting kicked around a lot, getting a lot of play here in the HSP community, is this idea of the word sensitive. There has been some talk about relabeling this characteristic. Now, the scientific term is sensory processing sensitivity, which sounds a whole lot different than sensitive. Sensitive has got so many pejorative connotations in our culture that it's really hard, even when you go into it armed to the teeth with education and talking about the benefits of the trait and all that kind of stuff. So it is kind of tough having to speak to that idea, but ultimately, underneath whatever label we call it, right, we still have to speak to the trait itself. And there's going to always be the things like being overwhelmed and overstimulated. Some people are going to see that as weak. Especially other men are going to see it that way. But you know what I try to do, Lisa, is I look at every man, especially men that are in sort of confrontational situation with me about what I'm talking about, is the idea that underneath that exterior, there's a little boy in there who went through the same thing that I went through. Probably was told he was not allowed to cry, he was not allowed to be this or be that. Maybe some things he wanted to do that might have sort of danced around the edge of sensitivity. And they're very defensive about it now. So you have to come at it from that place. And if you do that, the thing is you don't take it so defensively. You know, this is something highly sensitive people I do naturally, right? Is that, oh my gosh, they're pushing back, I better withdraw here. But I found that taking a more offensive approach to this and not defending the trait, but just still educating about what it is and why it's here and why nature put it into place. It's not some kind of freakish aberration. It's not an abnormality. It's perfectly normal. Has made it a lot easier for me to admit it. And that's why I say a lot of men are going to have to get educated about it. They need to get educated on the trait itself so that they can go out and do that. However they want to call it. You might call it, well, I'm more empathetic, or you might call, I have this, with the new term that Dr. Tracy Cooper's been using, is high sensory intelligence, which is a very positive sounding, phrase. However you use the term, whatever you do, ultimately you have to come back and describe the traits underneath it. But that may just be that label that you need to get past, because that's where really where the pushback comes from.
Yeah, I think what you say is probably really relatable to so many men, especially like growing up and being told you have to be like a man's man sort of thing. And in terms of like relabeling it, that's quite tough as well, because I feel like sometimes, I don't know, relabeling a word, even though it means the same thing, it's just, I don't know, I feel like it's...
Well, you know what, I tend to agree with you.
Is there a point to it?
It's like polishing up a carrot and saying it's a filet mignon.
Yeah, I feel like they try to do that so much these days.
Yeah, so I will support Dr. Cooper on this.
Yeah.
I'm not against it. I'm just saying that
no.
I'm highly vested in this term sensitive. I got a website that uses it. I've got books. I'm going to just press forward. I'm not ashamed or whatever anymore. And I think if I can make a convincing argument to people, I think I can make them come around.
Yeah, I think it's about, not being ashamed of it. Like, that's the whole point of it.
Right.
Like, not to be afraid of the word. What challenges would you say more sensitive people often face in a world where being sensitive isn't seen as particularly good in their day-to-day life, maybe?
Well, we talked about one a minute ago, which was relationships. A lot of times it's really hard for highly sensitive people to feel acknowledged, or in many cases to fit in. That's probably one of the big ones. But think about work environments too. A lot of times highly sensitive people will be put in something that sort of came about in the last probably 20 years, is this idea of open workspaces where you have kind of like what used to be back when I was working was what they call cubicle farms, where you would just have these high barrier cubicles that you could work in and have some of privacy. Open workspaces might be hard for highly sensitive people because there's too many distractions, there's too much noise. Some people thrive in that. I understand the logic behind it, more interaction with people, you get more ideas tossed about, but highly sensitive people don't work that way. They need more privacy and more time to think, right? And that's So that's an area where they might be a little bit more challenged than others, is the work environment. Socially, getting out, joining things, joining groups might be more difficult as well for highly sensitive people. I think one of the problems with highly sensitive, more than anything else, is they feel like, okay, well, I have this trait and I do these things, and there's nothing I can do about it, right?
Mm.
The idea is that there are things you can do about it. You can learn things, techniques and tools and whatever to help you deal with these challenges that you might face. So, for example, if you're constantly being overwhelmed and you want to build sort of a resiliency in your brain, you might learn to do meditation. You might learn to do breathing techniques. You might learn to do self-hypnosis. You might have a whole suite of things that are out there. Boy, we have a lot of stuff out there now. That you can use that are kind of mind hacks that can help people get through some of these difficult and challenging times. So I think part of the problem is that highly sensitive people sometimes think, okay, nobody understands me, I don't know what to do, and so therefore I'm just going to stay sort of stuck in this one spot. What you had said earlier about relationship is there's a certain degree of adaptability that we all need to do. We all need to learn to adapt in the environment. We can't live as islands, and we're not supposed to live as islands. So we need to learn some of these coping mechanisms that are easily available and easy to learn. There's nothing complicated about it. Meditation is probably the most portable technique you can carry anywhere with you. Get out in nature, walk, relax, learn to relax. You know, one of the funny things, Lisa, when I was doing hypnosis, is when I would ask people to, I'm going to count down and I want you to relax, most of the time people didn't even know what that meant. They knew what the word was, but they didn't know it in their body. They didn't know how to feel. So I had to teach them how to get to a point where they relax. And I think that's sort of the same thing that's occurring with a lot of highly sensitive people. They just don't know. They know they should, but they don't know how.
Yeah. Do you find that highly sensitive people are more likely to be able to be hypnotized?
I think they're more receptive to that. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, it's kind of hard to say, because you got to realize too that highly sensitive people, even though there's 1.5 billion of us, we're all individuals and we all have different levels. And one of the things I found about hypnosis and being receptive and susceptible to hypnotic suggestion was the ability of the person to let go. You know, they have to be trusting. You have to let go. So you have to build really good rapport with your clients in order to do that. So highly sensitive people could be kind of on the fence both ways. They could be more open to that. I find highly sensitive people are more open to these kind of things, right? Because I think inherently we're always looking for some kind of mind hack because we know we need to do something, right? And that's the way it was with me. But they can also be maybe less trusting too, and so they might not let go as easily. But once they learn to do that and they realize that it's not going to be a threat to them, they're very receptive to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Also, I think if people were more open and there was more of an awareness to highly sensitive people, there would be like more role models for people who would be like open about it, and then I think people would be better able to, you know, not give up in the sense like, oh, you know, I have this, well, that's kind of an excuse. I might not try hard, you know. Do you know what I'm saying?
I absolutely know what you're saying. In fact, it's probably a pretty good description of my life. At some point, once you become aware of what it is that is your challenge or your obstacle, whatever it is you want to call it, acknowledging that is the first step. And then looking for solutions to it is what should happen next. And once you do that, you start to realize this can be true for anything that I consider to be a challenge. I look for the solution. I just pick that works for me, whatever works for me. It's not that all these things are going to work for everybody, but you have to find what works for you, and you have to be willing to go look for it. Right? And I'm finding that more and more highly sensitive people that I talk to are in that place. They're starting to say, yes. It's amazing because there's lots of Facebook groups out there for highly sensitive people, and you see the chatter going back between people about things. The willingness that highly sensitive people have to help other highly sensitive people. the tips they have and what they share with each other is really important too. So it really is becoming a community, which there never was one before. Nobody, we didn't have this kind of connectivity we have today. But now that the trait's out there and it's been sort of documented and researched and books have been written about it, people are becoming aware of it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really good. What sort of research do they kind of focus on? Do you know?
The research has got a long way to go, in my opinion. We've got a lot of work to do, right? I think the more awareness we bring, the more funding likelihood we're going to get for more
Yeah, for sure.
detailed research. I would like to see research on how the best way to raise a highly sensitive child is. Things that are practical, not just, and I'm not saying any of the other research is not practical, but it something that can have a useful purpose that can be taken out to the world and used. They're doing a lot of things now. They're starting up with this fMRI, magnetic resonant imaging of the areas of the brain that light up when a highly sensitive person sees this or does this or whatever. Those are going to be important too, because it's going to help with the mapping of how our brains are wired. Those kind of studies will be really good, and those are great because they're objective, right? They're not,
Yeah.
can't deceive you by giving you a verbal answer this way or that. So it's going to be, I think, kind of I hope the focus goes into the areas like that. Now that's expensive research too, so this is where getting funding to do more research about all these things that we're talking about is going to be very important.
Mm-hmm. So on one hand, we have men that feel like they have to be hyper-masculine, and they may struggle to embrace being hypersensitive, or just showing emotion in general. But then there's also this other argument that men have gone soft and there's not enough masculinity. So in the sense, the Mr. Nice Guy syndrome, men getting called sexist for holding doors open for women, often like competitiveness and dominance is seen as negative all the time when it's not always negative. How would you respond to this? Do you think there's a war on masculinity, or do you think that a masculine man can coexist with being like sensitive at the same time?
Well, that's why I like to...
Like masculine in the traditional sense.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Whenever a change happens, a lot of times the pendulum has to swing wide, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to do that, when you swing wide like that, it may seem like you're going in the opposite direction. What I'm really looking for is a more inclusive definition for masculinity. A lot of these things are old traditional roles, but holding the door open and doing all that stuff is fine. I mean, a lot of people, especially a lot of women, like to be treated like that. Other women don't, right? There's a lot of women who don't like being that. So what I think we need to acknowledge is that the world has changed, all right? We're not still running around with, 19th century values. We're not Victorians anymore. We're a modern, post-industrial, information age culture. And what's happening too is that there's so many people that are now sort of stepping forward and stepping out of the traditional male-female box, and they want to express themselves as who they are. That's going to offend a lot of people, and a lot of people don't want to let go of the old values. They have emotional ties to them, and I understand that in a way, because like I said, I grew up in that kind of environment. I'm not saying we have to wholesale change everything, and the other thing is I'm not saying we have to throw everything out either. I think it's a positive thing that men assume a protector role with their families and with their partners, but it's getting protector confused with dominance, right? And getting protector confused with rolling over somebody else, or that you own them, therefore you must protect them. That's the kind of thing I think those are the kinds of things that we're opening up the corridor and we're looking at and saying, what can we change here? What can be more reflective of the world we live in today? And I think people probably of your generation are more open to that. They're more open to these ideas that people can express themselves individually and uniquely. And so confining to old traditional models is just, I just don't see it holding up over time. And a lot of the things that, there are a lot of things that about masculine energy is what I would like to call it, because it really isn't about necessarily men. It's about the cultural uh, costume that men put on that we call masculinity. That's the part
Mm-hmm.
that I'm talking about, not things that are hardwired into men versus women and that kind of thing. So it's going to be touchy. It's going to be controversial. There's no question about it. And there's going to be a lot of pushback. But it's going to
Mm.
change. It's going to change. It's going to have to, because I think what's some of the biggest problems we have in the world today can be traced back to these ideas of dominance, of exploitation, of inequality, and so forth, that somehow can be tied back to the old traditional masculine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's not about men. I'm not singling men out. What I'm saying is that this thing that we call masculinity, masculine energy, needs to be looked at.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think because like the world we live in has changed so much compared to what it used to be. And I think a lot of like those like hyper masculine traits, um, they're not needed like they might have once had to be needed, you know? We live like a lot more of a more comfortable life, you know, a lot safer. Like the world has completely changed compared to what our ancestors would have had.
Absolutely, and that's the most important part, right? Is acknowledging where we are. We don't live 200 years ago. We don't live 1,000 years ago, or 10,000, or 100,000 years ago. We live now, and our culture has changed. We've evolved into this, and that's the problem with evolution. Sometimes people just reject it because it's not what they're familiar with. It's not what they're comfortable with. But it happens, and it just rolls on, right?
Hmm.
You have to go with it. So
Yeah. To me, a truly masculine man is one that doesn't shy away from his emotions. And that doesn't mean he has to sacrifice what might be considered like the more traditional masculine traits, you know. I think they can and I think they should coexist. Um, so, what do you think the benefits of being more sensitive and in touch with your emotions are on both a personal and societal level?
well, on a personal level, your mental health is at stake here. It's that simple, you know. Being in touch with your emotions, being able to express your emotions. Again, we have emotions for a reason. They serve a purpose, right? They drive behavior a lot of times. We internalize so much of our emotions, but when we repress emotions or suppress them, right, we're going against what nature designed us to be. And the health consequences, both physical and mental, are real. And so, at a personal level, that's something that needs to be considered. Uh, Oddly enough, male suicide rates are going up, especially in groups over 50. But I think it's across the board as well. And a lot of that has to do with the idea that men can't ask for help and they can't feel like they're helpless at times. They can't acknowledge that they've got these feelings of helplessness, or not being able to cope with it. So, you know, as an individual level, like I said, it is all about mental and physical health. You need to be able to do that. At a societal level, I think the repression, and there's studies that are showing this too, that repression of these feelings leads to more aggressive behavior, especially in men. This aggression could be violent, uh, could be attacks on other people, um, in all forms of aggression. I think from a societal level, we could learn to maybe slow down a little bit, not to be so quick to judge, not to be a little bit less tempered, I mean, a little more tempered on our anger, and a little bit higher on our compassion and understanding. You know, we've got a war going on the world knows about right now that's appalling that it's happening. But this is that kind of aggression, right? That needs to stop. We're in the 21st century and we're still doing this. This is insane. So at a societal level, I think being able, for men particularly, to be able to express these emotions and feel these things, get them out in the open, where they can be talked about and helped if there's something that's impacting the individual, has a kind of a cascading effect. I mean, you drop a pebble in a pool of water and it just it ripples out. This is what happens at an individual level. And if you multiply that by 1 billion plus times or 7 billion, you can see what happens to us. So I think we are at a juncture in human history. We need to make some decisions about how we're going to move forward here, because we are quickly wrecking our planet, and we are, in some cases on the verge of wider war. We don't need that. We don't need that kind of stuff anymore. So.
Yeah, we need a complete overhaul, really, of so many of these systems that are really negatively impacting a lot of the world. And I don't think, I think, if you're holding in all this emotion, it's just going to keep building up and building up, no good's going to come of it. And we really need to start teaching people, how to handle their inner selves better.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like I said, it's not all just about highly sensitive people, it's about all people.
Yeah.
We need to do that. I truly believe that highly sensitive people were put here for evolutionary purpose. That's something that Dr. Aaron has talked about as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have a purpose that we're baked in for a reason. Otherwise, we would have been selected out 100,000 years ago, but we weren't. So I think there's a reason for us being here. And I think this is a time when we really need to step up and show that empathetic and emotional kindness and compassion that we can do, so that other people can say, "Yeah, it's okay." And I think one of the things you talked about earlier for highly sensitive people is to step up and just embrace the trait and get out there. You start to realize the message you're delivering is really something that people want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just it's just not about defining who you are, but it's also showing and modeling behaviors that other people really want to see.
Mm-hmm. How do you think we can start recognizing highly sensitive people more? What changes do you think we as a society need to take to be able to take them more seriously, the trait?
I think a lot of that is going to be on highly sensitive people.
Mm-hmm.
I remember writing somewhere with a blog or something that the world isn't necessarily going to change for us, isn't going to make accommodations for us. But the world will make accommodations for people that appear to be valuable, right? And I think that we need to start owning up the trait, and we need to start stepping out, talking about it more, and like I said, doing the modeling. It doesn't have to be every highly sensitive person has to have a world stage. They don't have to do TED Talks. They don't have to write books necessarily. But you can do it on a local level. You could do it in your school systems, or you could do it with your community, your family, your friends, and your religious organizations, whatever you belong to. And we need to start spreading that way. It's interesting, I wrote a blog just recently about when I was younger, I took Transcendental meditation. That's the meditation technique the Beatles learned, Maharishi Yogi, when I was in college. And one of the things they talked about is that one Maharishi had said that 1% of people meditating on a particular topic and with the intent of peace or something like that, and targeting it to a focal area like a city or something, could actually affect what happens in the world, actually make people start changing without realizing it. And they did studies on it, and I don't know if it exactly was cause and effect relationship, but the studies suggested that cities that they did the meditation focused on, crime rates went down, violence went down, and those during that period of time. So my point about bringing that up is the idea that a small group of people can make a big difference. Again, it's that one little stone in the pond rippling out across a wide expanse. And I really think highly sensitive people, not even all highly sensitive people, but a percentage of the highly sensitive people out there who start recognizing the trait, embracing it, and going out and sort of evangelizing about it, I think is going to make a difference.
Yeah, no, that's quite a cool story. I definitely think we are so much more connected than we even realize, like, because there's just not enough research done on the whole connectivity of humans as a species. So that's definitely like an interesting topic that they should do more research on.
Right. I agree. I totally agree.
There's also something that I've come across called neurofeedback training. What is that, and how does that kind of relate to
Well, there's
highly sensitive people?
There's a couple of different forms of that. Well, there's a lot of forms of it, but I did neurofeedback using a system that was developed by two psychologists in Canada, and it is uses sort of the traditional tools, uses EEG sensors, those little sensors they stick on your scalp to read an electromagnetic signal. And this particular tool, most neurofeedback tools read the signal and send it to some computer software, and then there's a feedback loop that comes back to the individual. So a lot of times it's a learning experience where they're trying to calm their brain or something, and it's almost like a feedback loop, where they're getting a signal or something that's telling them that their mind is relaxing, and so they concentrate on it and they relax, and that's the feedback loop. Well, this particular software that I had was very passive. People could sit and literally go to sleep if they wanted to. What it was doing is reading on the central section of the skull, was reading the different brainwave activity was going on. And there were it was a complicated algorithm which I can't explain to because I don't know, but it detects those particular moments when learning can take place. Something is going on in the brain. And what it would do is they would listen to an audio signal as music, and then it would be an interrupt on the music that would alert their subconscious. Now, what was nice about this was that because it's bypassing all of your prefrontal cortex and your analytical part of your brain, you don't interfere with it. You don't say, well, I can't do that, or it's not going to work for me. It's already communicating back and forth with those areas. It really was very effective. I did it on myself quite a bit. And I noticed that it was helping to create resiliency in my brain. So whenever I would have a experience that might be emotionally difficult, I would find that my recovery time from the time I had the emotion to the time I was sort of back to a normal state again was shorter. And so it was helping me in terms of coping with emotional impacts and things like that. And it's worked with a lot of different people on a lot of different things. I think the one thing that it's for sure has been validated for is that it works really well with kids with ADHD. But a lot of people swear for depression, for anxiety, for stress, and things like that. Those are all things that can work for too.
So it just goes over the pathways and creates stronger pathways, so then when you do experience something that uses that path.
Yeah, it gives you some kind, it's reading what the signals are coming off your brain, which is looking at the sort of electromagnetic energy that's going on, and the different brainwave lengths, like beta, alpha, theta, gamma, etc. And it's giving you some type of feedback. Now, most traditional neurofeedback is where you're actually consciously aware of the feedback. So you're learning from the feedback your brain is giving you. It's kind of a training. And in some cases, they are able to modulate whether a certain amount of alpha is going on a particular lobe of the brain and that kind of thing. So it can get very complicated. But for the most part, it's a way of getting feedback to you at a level, just like you were taking, if you put an EKG on and you get your heart rate and that kind of thing. That's how they find out, the health of your heart. Well, they can do the same thing with these EKGs.
Interesting.
Electroencephalogram. EEG, excuse me. I get them mixed up
EEGs.
all the time.
So what advice would you give to a highly sensitive person? And what would you give to other people who are not highly sensitive, but maybe they know someone that is, or maybe they just want to be more sensitive themselves.
Right. I think the number one thing is get educated about it. If you're highly
Mm-hmm.
sensitive, you suspect that you're highly sensitive. hsperson.com is the best place to start. It is the Elaine Aron's site, and it's got a lot of resources. You can Google highly sensitive, you can get all kinds of websites and so forth. I would recommend starting with hers. And there's books out there. Hers are sort of the benchmark books. If you're a man, there's books by Ted Zeff, who's unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but he was one of the first ones to start writing about HSP men. Tracy Cooper has also written a lot of books. I've written books. Tom Falkenstein is a German psychotherapist who's written a book in the last couple of years on sensitive men. So there's enough material that you can get your teeth sunk into. If you're not highly sensitive, but you know somebody who is, I would do the same route. You may not have to go as much detail, but what you want to do is understand the trait well enough to understand where you can start seeing the patterns in the person that is that you know is highly sensitive. That will help you understand them more. Maybe you could have some more talks with them too, more honest discussions about the sensitivity. And be honest with them too. You're right. You need that feedback. If that's your partner and you're having a rough time with the fact that you feel like everything you say is causing them to react, give them constructive feedback on that. It's the way you deliver the feedback more than it is the feedback. It's not that highly sensitive people can't handle criticism. It's the way that criticism's delivered. And very often it's delivered very insensitively. And a lot of people don't know how to do criticism effectively. And so that's something that you just need to be mindful of.
Okay. And I have one last question. Is there anything that I haven't asked that, because of my lack of knowledge, basically, that you think would be an important thing that you would like to share and let more people know about?
You know what, Lisa, this has been one of the most comprehensive interviews I've had on the topic. A lot of people will ask me a couple of questions and just kind of let me ramble for whatever time. You've been very good about getting to the heart of it. I think you've covered just about everything that I would say. I would say for highly sensitive people particularly, take heart. There are a lot of people out there who have this personality trait. It's not an abnormality. It may feel like it sometimes, but it's not. And try to get connected at some level with other highly sensitive people, because you will suddenly, it'll just like open you up, because you'll find that you have people who understand you, inherently understand you, without you having to say a whole lot. And that's validating, and that makes you feel better. And I think that's a good place to start, in other words, to start embracing the trait, is realize there's other people out there just like you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.